take part. Okay, whenever you're ready, Simon. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Douglas, and it's my pleasure to call you all to order. And also, I must say, it's a real pleasure to see both speakers in the list of participants, because the last session I chaired at an online conference, one of the speakers joined partway through. So thank you for saving me those palpitations. So after our marvelous conspectus of the Empire, we move in the next session to journeys, one to the Arctic, one to a more mysterious realm. So our first speaker is Anne Chapman from Glasgow Caledonian University, London, a postgraduate campus of Glasgow Caledonian University. Anne researches the interplay of cultural and social forms in the 19th and early 20th century, with interests shared, I'm sure, by many people on this call in periodical culture and short fiction. Her most recent publication is the collection Coding and Representation from the 19th Century to the Present, Scrambled Messages, co-edited with Natalie Hume, and her enticing title is There is Nothing So Artistic as a Haze, the Periodical Context, Evasive Genres, and Unstable Authority of the Glamour of the Arctic. Anne, welcome.
Thank you so much, Simon. I am just going to attempt to share my screen, which may take me a second. There we go. And I think if I start the slideshow, that should be okay. How's that looking? Is that okay, Simon?
Yes, that looks good from here.
Perfect. Good. Okay. Thank you, everyone. There we go. So in 1880, Conan Doyle paused his medical studies to work as a surgeon on board the Arctic whaling ship Hope. Here he experienced an adventure he would describe in his autobiography as a strange and fascinating chapter of his life. 12 years later, The Glamour of the Arctic, weaving together scenes from life on a whaling ship and the whales that they hunted, was published in the illustrated magazine The Idler. Towards the end of the piece, on contemplating the unknown past of the region, Conan Doyle asserts that, when we know everything about this earth, the romance and poetry will all have been wiped away from it. There is nothing so artistic as a haze. In this paper, I consider the haze of narrative created by Conan Doyle's layering of genres and further thickened by its publishing context. Whaling was in decline, and its practice altered from the way it was conceived in the popular imagination. The Arctic and its history had yet to be fully apprehended. What this haze does, I want to argue, is trouble notions of authority in Conan Doyle's and his illustrators' presentation of that known only by a small number of experts. The Idler, an illustrated monthly magazine, first appeared in February 1892 under the editorship of Jerome K. Jerome and Robert Barr. It was announced with some fanfare. The Review of Reviews described it as a formidable rival for the Strand magazine. J.R. Tighe gives the sales of its first monthly issue as 200,000 and adds that between 1895 and 97, 100,000 copies were produced per month. These circulation figures suggest its popularity, as does its persistence until 1911, albeit with slight changes to its title and with other editors. The Idler was a journal that was comfortable with being seen to meet mass market demand, and indeed, Laura Casson-Fiss has explored a regular column in the magazine in which its contributors treated the notion of exclusivity itself as a joke. This serial column was known as the Idlers Club. Casson-Fiss's study of it explains that, and I quote, magazine readership is commonly associated with mass consumerism, commercial transaction, and anonymous global distribution, whereas the club suggests a cosy friendship among select members that excludes everyone else. She finds the tone of the club column to foster a relaxed atmosphere in which the reader has some intimacy with literary celebrities. It imitated club talk, less a dialogue, more light-hearted talking without listening. Thus, this column created an intimate, imagined space for its mass readership, she says. Although Conan Doyle did not contribute to this column, if we are to read it as Casson-Fiss suggests, as what she calls a microcosm of the journal as a whole, then his contributions to the Idler's imagined space are inflected with an intimacy at odds with any expected distance between the authority of the writer and their audience. Over the years, Conan Doyle shared many pieces with this seemingly intimate space. The short story De Profundis, then an account of his development as an author in My First Book, and the four of the stories that would later appear in the collection Round the Red Lamp. From 1894 to 95, it was also home to the Stark-Munro letters. Given his own Arctic adventure, one might imagine that the glamour of the Arctic would employ an authoritative tone, with Conan Doyle as an experienced guide. Yet he shifts between genres, layering one upon the other, and thus the glamour of the Arctic gives a sense of authorial uncertainty, of his purpose not quite being clear, of him being quite caught up in the glamour of their voyage. Such a narrative envelops the audience in this haze. Although we now know about Conan Doyle's time as ship's surgeon, he does not represent the glamour of the Arctic as an autobiography or as travel writing. It is less settled than that. Conan Doyle commences somewhat ethnographically, contemplating the seamen involved in whaling. But it is a report with a touch of mystery, describing that which is difficult to imagine. He begins, "It is strange to think that there is a body of men in Great Britain, the majority of whom have never since their boyhood seen the corn in the fields." He moves quickly back to a nostalgic history of whaling. He talks of old men, of an honourable old trade. This history lacks precision, however. There is a vagueness to it that contributes to the haze. He uses the indeterminate phrase, "there was a time," and reminisces back vaguely to the earlier part of the century. He brings emotion to his description of the decline of the trade as he regrets, "Alas, the whaling appears to be upon its last legs, and its brave and hardy seamen will soon be a thing of the past." This is not an objective account. He's taken with the whalers. In an attempt to explain this decline, Conan Doyle quickly shifts again to natural history, full now of admiration for the prey of the men he has just been praising. He describes the whale as highly intelligent and able to understand the means of its capture, having found a way to evade its pursuers. It seems that the glamour arising from being in awe of everything. This all prevents Conan Doyle fixing his narrative on any one thing. But being in awe of both hunter and prey leads Conan Doyle to shift the narrative again. We find ourselves reading an adventure, the hunt itself. He breathlessly writes, "And the lancing too, when the creature is spent and your boat pulls in to give it the coup de grace with cold steel, that is also exciting. 100 tons of despair are churning the waters up into a red foam. Two great black fins are rising and falling like the sails of a windmill, casting the boat into a shadow as they droop over it. But still the harpooner clings to the head where no harm can come, and with the wooden butt of the 12-foot lance against his stomach, he presses it home until the long struggle is finished and the black back rolls over to expose the livid whitish surface beneath." With exclamation, with black dramatically against red, with both hunter and prey in desperation, either clinging or despairing, Conan Doyle races in excitement through the adventure of the death of the whale. And so in the first 2 pages, Conan Doyle has moved through 3 genres already, and we are unclear whether we are reading a history, natural history, a tale of adventure. I think I might have missed a slide, so let me just, apologies. The ambiguity persists as he returns to his description of whales. A useless in commercial terms rorqual whale is 80 foot, but its spray is like smoke, and where green is turning to black, the huge flickering figure glides under the ship. It is both measurable and insubstantial. Conan Doyle uses the word strange here to describe both the sight and the sound of the whale, yet he is also able to compare the gullet size of different types. The text wavers between expertise and mystery. The same occurs when he comes to the harpooner. He is quick to dispel any notions his readers may have gathered from books. He explains that this gallant seaman who stands at the prow of the boat, waving harpoon over his head with a line snaking out into the air behind him, is only to be found in Paternoster Row. This is a figure relegated to print, and it seems for good reason. He puts this as simply as possible, that one could shoot both harder and faster than one could throw. However, at the same time, Conan Doyle wants to cling to the popular but outdated image, welcomes its outrageousness and impossibility, in print at least. The glamour of the Arctic is not only a result of physically experiencing it then, but is also affected imaginatively through popular understandings perpetuated on the page. In immediate contrast, Conan Doyle proceeds to detail the reliable reality of the swivel gun used by the harpooners now. The details he gives are precise. He names the Oakham wad, details it having 28 drams of powder, and it is impressive, like a huge horse pistol. His knowledge of harpooning does not end here either. He describes the intricacies of its use, its idiosyncrasies, its movement. Whilst this precise detail suggests expert knowledge on Conan Doyle's part, he nonetheless seems in awe. It is so difficult and an art, but he barely represents the harpooner in action amongst this description. In spite of the complications, Conan Doyle only describes him firing straight down. The crew are also absent from the action Conan Doyle portrays, although the boat must be manoeuvred. We only glimpse the whalers lighting their pipes and keeping their legs apart while the line runs merrily. He can describe the equipment, but not the actions involved in its use. Thus, Conan Doyle seems to both have and lack expertise. He also maintains a vagueness to his experience. Not that he fails to clarify that he has experience. For example, he tells us that he has looked a whale directly in the eye and explains, "I cannot easily forget the mutex postulation which I read in one, as it dimmed over in death within a hand's touch of me." He knows the whalers intimately too, claiming, "I have known a grizzled harpooner burst into tears when he saw by his slack line that he had missed his mark." However, in relating his experience, Conan Doyle fails to explain his position amongst the crew, and his reasons for voyaging go unnamed. In neglecting these details, he can forego including his real expertise within the crew, something not associated with the glamour of the Arctic, but that which we today know that his contemporary readers might not, his role as ship's surgeon. But nor can we really understand his involvement with that which he does describe. The gap revealed by avoiding his position on the ship and the apparent limits to his knowledge leads Conan Doyle to turn to reporting the tales of the whalers. Indeed, he notes that singular incidents occur in these northern waters, and there are a few old whalers who have not their own queer yarn. His inclusion of anecdote and tall tales only adds to the hazy glamour with which his text veils the Arctic. This allows him to introduce the beast as foe, a distinctive and elusive whale who has evaded capture over 15 years. This perhaps harks back to the romance of the harpooners represented in print that he raised earlier in the text. He is weaving imaginary understandings with the facts he presents. Making use of anecdote also affords him the opportunity to suggest the possibility of finding a passage to the North Pole, though he gives a caveat that some little margin must be allowed, no doubt, for expansive talk over a pipe and a glass. He writes of gnarled and rugged old ice, impossible to pass, and relates an 1827 attempt where it seemed the impassable ice persisted to the pole. Then he adds the whaler's view, which suggests that there have been times when they have seen no ice at all at a similar distance north to that 1827 voyage. However, he continues with what seems to be an excuse for failed discovery. They are in the service of a company. They are there to catch whales, and there is no adequate inducement to make them risk themselves, their vessels, or their cargoes in a dash for the north. These are different experts' tales, and the reader is left to wonder what could be the truth of it. And the Arctic, again, through Conan Doyle's layering, is tantalisingly veiled with that hazy glamour. It is not only Conan Doyle's verbal text, however, that contributes to this enchanting effect. An implication of considering the glamour of the Arctic in the context of The Idler is that visual elements contribute to the storytelling. Throughout the text are scattered unattributed photographs, such as this Shetlander, and illustrations by A. Webb, such as this ship just off. It is not Conan Doyle's narrative alone. A range of scholarship suggests how we might read 19th century illustrated texts. Robert L. Patton explains that illustrations are not mimetic, they are not the text pictured. To say then that an illustrator illustrates a text might mean that the artist enlightens the text, he says. Stuart Sillars explains how technological developments created a unified discourse of word and image. And Julia Thomas's study Pictorial Victorians has demonstrated the significance of reading these texts as a unified discourse. She finds that the meanings generated in the very interaction between the textual and the visual, the points at which they coincide and conflict, end quote. An example of this coincidence would be where Webb's illustration titled Blocked, shown here, intersects the different stories of the attainability of the North Pole. Here the ice obscures the ship and the crew are absent. Webb gives no hint of them among the rigging or on the deck or attempting to man the boats. The edges of the drawing of the ship are sharp and straight, contributing to the impression of an absence of movement. The stillness of the ship contrasts with the looming of the ice jaggedly rising in the foreground. Its dominance and its apparent thwarting of the ship's progress make it difficult to imagine that the ice could clear from the sea. Thus, the image casts at least some doubt on the whaler's account of ice-free seas. On the opposite page, however, the photograph of the Shetlander illustrates a suggestion made by Conan Doyle that the possibility of clear passage to the pole could be tested. He suggests that a crew comprising Scotch and Shetland seamen from the Royal Navy could make yearly expeditions with a chance of finding clear sea. This photograph is sharp, solid. The Shetlander, titled so as to appear to be representative of a type, looks us right in the eye and his mouth set firm. This appears to be a reliable image of confidence and determination, strengthening the plausibility of Conan Doyle's proposition. Thus, these two images merge across the spread of the 2 pages to have similar effect to Conan Doyle's narrative shifts. We move from an emphasis on impassable ice on one page to a type of man with the tenacity to overcome the growing obstacle on the next. Like the layering of genre and the elusive expertise in Conan Doyle's writing, the shifts between Webb's illustrations and the photographs as they imbricate with the text both allow for the precision and romance that create the glamour of the Arctic and give a sense of the spell cast by the whaling voyage amongst the icy seas. The illustrated text as a whole seems to suggest what Conan Doyle might mean when he writes, "You stand on the very brink of the unknown." In contemplating that brink, Conan Doyle suggests in his concluding paragraph that in writing The Glamour of the Arctic, he has been dazzled. He states, "There is a good deal which I had meant to say as if somehow distracted from his purpose." He at once destabilizes his authority to relate the things that throw the glamour over the Arctic, as he also acknowledges that these missing utterances have all been said much better already. Nonetheless, his final move is to present himself as innovative in writing on the region, and he does so in a way that draws on an area in which he was known to hold expertise. He attends to the medical and curative side of the Arctic. The haze seems to lift. He writes, "Davos Platz has shown what cold can do in consumption, and in the life-giving air of the Arctic Circle, no noxious germ can live." Straightforward and with clarity, Conan Doyle presents what he terms a safe prophecy. Before many years are past, steam yachts will turn to the north every summer with a cargo of the weak-chested, and people will understand that nature's icehouse is a more healthy place than her vapor bath. It seems an ideal grounded scientifically in the Arctic air, not in its enchanting glamour. It is an ideal seemingly far from maintaining the romance that so appealed to the author when there is nothing so artistic as a haze. But Conan Doyle's words are not the end of the narrative. Rather, Webb's final illustration brings us back to both the whale and the seaman with whom Conan Doyle was so in awe. This illustration differs greatly from Webb's other images. Where they reflected the Arctic haze through soft washes, here Webb hatches lines. There is no haze in his visual representation of his ideal end, only entirely clear lines. And so both Conan Doyle and Webb conclude with the clarity emerging from the haze of the rest of the piece. However, Webb seems utterly at odds with Conan Doyle. In bringing us back to the whale and its potential for devastation, his illustration seems to mock Conan Doyle's idealization of the medical benefits of an Arctic voyage, where these creatures lie beneath the surface. The begging seaman, apparently injured by the whale, smiles nonetheless, perhaps encouraging us not to pity him, but to laugh at Conan Doyle's proposition, given the danger. And yet, the seaman's illustration of his disaster returns us to Conan Doyle's earlier description of harpooning a whale. There he wrote, "Should the whale cast its tail in the air after the time-honoured fashion of the pictures, that boat would be an evil case. But, fortunately, when frightened or hurt, it does no such thing, but curls its tail up underneath it like a cowed dog and sinks like a stone." If that is the case, then the seaman's picture, the potential danger of whales, seems to be pure imagination. Conan Doyle's prophecy of curative voyages can exist with the other ideal, the romantic notions of whaling. In The Idler, however, the conclusion of The Glamour of the Arctic is not the end. It is returned to in the discussion of the Idlers Club in the issue. There, 3 experts put forth their opinions on Conan Doyle's proposal of repeated voyages to find passage to the pole: a whaling captain, Clement Markham and Admiral Markham. These experts have different opinions, but there is little glamour to their accounts. Their difference leave the reader, listening to the intimate club talk, still with no one expert. And even with its straightforward expression, this discussion only adds to the haze. The glamour evoked by Conan Doyle, Webb, and whoever selected and set the photographs, layering genres with information and hearsay, with the measurable and the elusive, suggests that expertise can sit comfortably with incomprehension and awe. What I think reading The Glamour of the Arctic as a collaborative storytelling within The Idler suggests is that we will be enchanted where the expert's reality and romantic imagination overlap. Thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed for such an acute reading of both word and image in your paper. We now move on to Mike Wilkinson, if you're there, Mike. Mike is a third-year English PhD candidate at the University of British Columbia, so presumably you're one of our cohort of early risers. Mike's current work looks at the literary use of heterodox spiritual movements in the long 19th century and their influence upon scientific belief and practice. And Mike's title is a difficult one to read out and get all of its nuances, but an awful journey. Spiritualism, science, and narrative energy in Arthur Conan Doyle's The Wanderings of a Spiritualist. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Simon. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yep, I can hear
Excellent. You. Okay. The Wanderings of a Spiritualist, written in 1921, is the first of Arthur Conan Doyle's travel narratives published shortly after the Great War. Following his shorter instructional tracts, The New Revelation, published in 1918, and The Vital Message, published in 1919, Wanderings furthers Doyle's conviction that the seance, the central ritual of spiritualist practice, offers empirical proof of the existence of the spirit world. For Doyle, the material manifestations of spirits provide a sharp contrast to what he labels as the abstruse philosophies and rituals of theosophy and the irrational and rigid dogmas of Christianity. As numerous scholars have remarked, spiritualism's preoccupation with empirical validation enabled its participation in a swath of negotiations about the scope of scientific inquiry, the construction of disciplinary boundaries, and even the definitions of what constitutes the material and the spiritual. While Doyle joined these discussions with his accustomed vigor, Wanderings uniquely reveals his growing use of the seance for advancing extraordinary narratives, and not merely to validate religious belief or scientific truths. Specifically, Wanderings exhibits Doyle's increasing tendency of using the awe of the seance, that different and wonderful world of the spirits, to build a sense of curiosity and expectation in his readers, which he channels towards investigations of the wider world. For this paper, I revised Mark Knight's recent work on the interaction between religious belief and constructed reading experiences in the long 19th century. Knight specifically focuses upon the Christian understanding of being caught between two worlds, the present one and the one to come. He traces this eschatological tension of being in the world but not of it in authors such as G.K. Chesterton and H.G. Wells, who draw upon religious beliefs to create semi-detached reading experiences where readers are neither in total absorption of an aesthetic experience nor critical detachment from it, but instead exist in both states simultaneously. Knight's analysis is part of a larger call to trace how religious belief and practice factor into constructed reading experiences. My paper extends Knight's theory of religion and reading to Doyle's spiritist beliefs. While numerous scholars have located a literary form shaped by spiritualism, their analysis tends to focus primarily upon the role of ontology in influencing notions of authorship and authority. This paper shifts the discussion to consider how, in Wanderings, Doyle marshals the overlapping worlds expressed by and experienced within spiritualist belief and practice to stimulate curiosity about the natural world in his readers. The seance thereby becomes a formal event that both structures and drives Doyle's narrative. Rather than an irreconcilable tension between two worlds of the type that Knight describes, Doyle utilizes the performance of the seance to create a feedback loop where material access to the other world creates a sense of awe and wonder in his readers, which feeds back into investigations of the natural world. Appropriate to its title, Wanderings takes the reader upon a meandering journey of Doyle's disparate intellectual musings on politics, religion, colonial history, and evolutionary biology, all while following the winding path of his lecture tour to Australia and New Zealand. The tone is casual and matter-of-fact, exhibiting Doyle's characteristic concern to appear as a relatable and honest public figure. Eschewing the aloof distinction of the specialist or great man, Doyle assures his readers that the narrative will be, quote, intensely personal and in plain English, and a, quote, go-as-you-please style of narrative. While the text thus appears to lack an organizational structure, Doyle uses his experiences of numerous seances to both punctuate and frame his geographical and intellectual wanderings. Doyle writes, quote, I think that our minds are so centered on this tiny mud patch that we are deaf and blind to all that impinges on us from the beyond. Swiftly, Doyle establishes that contact with the spirit world is not another extraordinary event in a string of others, but a privileged space of wonderment above this world. In the first page of Wanderings, Doyle describes a seance in Merthyr, Wales, in which he participated. He details this event as providing the initial motivation for his journey. He writes, graceful lights, signs of spirit power had hovered over us in the darkness. It was a different and a wonderful world. Now, with those voices still haunting our memories, we had slipped out into the material world, a world of glaring ironworks and twinkling cottage windows. As I looked down upon it all, I grasped my wife's hand in the darkness and cried aloud, my God, if they only knew, if they could only know. Perhaps in that cry, wrung from my very soul, lay the inception of my voyage to the other side of the world. Doyle presents here a bifurcated setting, the inside and outside, the material and the spiritual, this world and the next. Here, meeting the spirits means a transformative experience, mirroring a religious encounter with the transcendent, what Doyle describes as that different and wonderful world offered by the seance. Doyle continues to write that he and his wife sat for 2 hours listening to the spirits and sensing their presence, which, quote, quivered and wavered among us. The result of which Doyle says left, quote, my head throbbing and my whole frame quivering. The seance fully engages Doyle's senses, which both arrest his attention and carries it away to a special place of awe and attention above this tiny mud patch. However, Doyle does not remain transfixed for long. Neither does he allow the narrative to become carried away to the spirit world. Instead, Doyle crafts a narrative movement that he carries through the rest of his text. The awe of the spirit world, once established, immediately moves out into the wider material world, that space of twinkling cottage windows and glaring ironworks. Thus, the initial division between the spirit world of the seance and the wider world thins drastically, as Doyle pushes the reader out into the world of his travels. The ease of this divisional collapse comes partly because, as Doyle argues, the seance is a material experience and understood event, testable by empirical science, and therefore belonging in some part to the natural world. The laboratory-style tests applied to seances by figures such as Oliver Lodge and William Crookes had, for Doyle, demonstrated conclusively the validity of spirit manifestations. Doyle writes, quote, I have done with faith. It is a golden mist in which human beings wander in devil tracks with many a collision. I need the white clear light of knowledge. For that we build from below, brick upon brick, never getting beyond the provable fact. The overlapping spirit world thereby served for Doyle not only as a space of powerful subjective experience, but also one that is grounded upon a notion of scientific objectivity. Despite the apparent porousness between worlds, as well as the seance's validation by scientific testing, Doyle's sporadic insertions of seances within Wanderings serve consistently to re-establish the seance as a special site of interest beyond its function as a laboratory. Part of this is Doyle's assertion of the religious aspect of the seance, of spirit signs functioning to quote, arrest the attention of a material world. The manifestations of spirits serve to shake people out of what Doyle calls material grooves, those well-worn modes of thinking that result in the inability and refusal to pursue new lines of inquiry or to see materiality in fresh new ways. While this is partly an attack on the mechanistic determinism espoused by naturalists like Thomas Huxley and Herbert Spencer, Angela Fowler has pointed out that Doyle also criticizes an over-attachment to physical evidence, objects, and experiences. For Doyle asserts that, quote, people insist too much upon the direct proof of spiritualism. Echoing earlier arguments made by Alfred Russel Wallace, Doyle writes that the established objective existence of spirit phenomena must be honestly faced. Doyle writes, quote, the trouble is that you have to recognize a thing before you can regulate it, and the public has not properly recognized us. Paradoxically, then, Doyle asks for acceptance of spirit manifestations while also inviting his readers to conduct their own critical investigation of spiritualist claims. At the same time that Conan Doyle seems to separate spiritualism from science, writes Fowler, he reaffirms science by his insistence that it has been proven. This rhetorical dodge positions the seance as an awe-inspiring event that one must simply accept to recognize correctly. Wandering's larger narrative use of the seance showcases a function beyond empirical validation of the spirit world. The seance also works as a privileged site of wonder that serves to lead, perhaps even push, Doyle's reader into the wider world of his adventures. Consequently, the white clear light of knowledge offered by the seance illuminates not so much a greater knowledge of the spirit world, but of the natural world. For if seeing and understanding the material world correctly is the goal for Doyle, then the seance was perfectly suited to tap into notions of scientific objectivity, while simultaneously exposing the reader to the extraordinary realm of the spirits. This combination of curiosity and investigation allows Doyle to overlap his journeys to the spirit world with his, quote, voyage to the other side of this world. This double meaning folds his missionary journey into a Jules Verne-style adventure of discovery. While it would be impossible in this paper to analyze all Doyle's reflections and travels within Wanderings, a fairly lengthy book, I will focus upon the one that most clearly demonstrates how Doyle marshals the attending of the seance for discoveries within the wider material world. While in Melbourne, Australia, Doyle hears an extraordinary story substantiated by, quote, documentary and official evidence. A manhunt was instigated for two brothers, Frank and Hugh Brown, who sailed out into the local bay and never returned. Their father, who was fortunately a spiritualist, sought the help of a sensitive who, being skilled in psychometry, was able to track the brothers' last movements through physical contact with some of their belongings. When this trail went cold, the Brown family held a seance to contact the missing brothers. Doyle writes, the medium fell into a trance, and the two lads who had been trained in spiritual knowledge and knew the possibilities at once came through. They then gave a clear account of the capsizing of the yacht, how they had met their death, adding that they had found themselves after death in the exact physical conditions of happiness and brightness which their father's teachings had led them to expect. Doyle's full recounting of the story grounds the seance in religious awe and expectation, as it contains no small measure of emotion. The contact with the dead brothers is not just extraordinary, but exudes the consolation of happiness and brightness Doyle felt spiritualism could offer bereaved families, especially following the tremendous loss of the Great War. Yet Doyle conforms this awe-inducing story to a detective narrative, with the tracing material clues to the solution of a mysterious case. Rather than lingering upon the altered life of the deceased brothers, Doyle channels this surprising spiritual contact into a study of the brothers' material traces and their link to an existing mystery within the natural world. While the spirits of the brothers are summoned, their appearance brings with it the specific details of a mystery that, in its full form, comes from elsewhere. This narrative movement is reminiscent of, although not identical to, the Sherlock Holmes stories, where Holmes's cases often come unsought, crashing into his little consulting room. Despite this news from elsewhere, Doyle's spiritual-themed works are far less interested in descriptions of the afterlife compared to other contemporary spiritualist works. Marie Corelli, Florence Marryat, and Margaret Oliphant all take pains to detail the topography and moral landscape of the spirit world, whether as part of a fictional or non-fictional account. In contrast, Doyle's spirits sweep him up, but they do not carry him away. As with the story of the Brown brothers, the seance offers a surprising, effective experience. But Doyle's narrative is always slipping out from the seance, carrying the residual awe of encountering the spirits out into the wider world of his discoveries. While Doyle reflects upon the deceased brother's happiness in the spirit world, his narrative rarely lingers upon such consolatory moments. Even Doyle's final installment of his famous Professor Challenger series, The Land of Mist, reinforces its own title by leaving the realm of the spirits in ambiguity, his narrative concerned more with the spirit journey of its primary characters. Part of the reason for this might be Doyle's stated concern in developing an unhealthy interest in the spirit world, which he felt could easily distract from the moral requirements of this one. Doyle writes scathingly about those, quote, sensation mongers who run from medium to medium with no object but excitement or curiosity. But it is just as likely that for the man whose stated passions were change and adventure, reports of the spirit world were boring. Although Doyle writes that the spirits can and should grow their moral and intellectual capabilities, most spirits are depicted as living the leisurely life of the British upper classes. While Doyle looked forward to what he called the great repose after the strain of life, it would hardly make for a good story. The seance thereby functioned as a place of surprise and wonder, but Doyle felt this wonderment was better used to stimulate real life, instead of pushing attention to a narratively flat elsewhere. For Doyle, this real life, as Diana Barsham has detailed, was found in those, quote, fields of public endeavor, medical, legal, military, political, and religious, which would situate Doyle's name upon the larger inscriptions of nation and empire. Because of these commitments, Doyle's narrative use of the seance ensures that the awe generated by contact with the spirit world finds its terminus in the realm of public endeavor. The overlapping spirit world could serve as a source of awe and surprise, quickly transforming the prosaic everyday, a broader narrative movement that Douglas Kerr has observed in Doyle's other works. But in Wanderings, the seance becomes the extraordinary incident par excellence. And yet Doyle's decision to keep the spirit world as a somewhat impenetrable land of mist continually pushes the reader back into Doyle's world of concerns, albeit with a sense of curiosity and expectation constructed by the seance. Moreover, Doyle's exploitation of the seance's popular link to scientific investigation ensures that this slipping out occurs in a planned direction, towards greater discovery of the natural world, even at the cost of the spirit world. As Doyle concludes the story of the deceased brothers, he adds an interesting detail. During the seance, one of the brothers, speaking through the medium, states that he saw a fish tear off a portion of his brother's arm. When asked whether this was a shark, the spirit responds, "Well, it was not like any shark I have seen." Doyle then states that several weeks later, quote, a large shark of a rare deep sea species, unknown to the fishermen, and quite unlike the ordinary blue shark with which the Browns were familiar, was taken at Frankston. Inside it was found the bone of an arm, and also a watch, some coins, and other articles which had belonged to Frank Brown. The report of the Brown brothers, a seemingly straightforward account of nautical disaster, becomes transformed into a larger mystery through contact with the seance, culminating in the local discovery of a unique species of shark. Here, Doyle demonstrates the seance's ability to gather up his diverse interests, the utilization of his Holmesian branch of observation and detection, the discovery of latent mysteries, scientific advancement, all combined with an assurance that deceased loved ones are alive and well. But one cannot help but feel that the story of the Brown brothers, by checking so many narrative boxes, flattens the power of its own scientific and religious claims. Put another way, the narrative movement of Wanderings suggests that receptivity to awe of the spirits might be more important than belief, whether it be in credo formulation or in supposed scientific facts. For a text that so often draws upon the scientific language of objectivity to justify its contents, Wanderings demonstrates the strange ability to subject such language under the aegis of narrative awe, making the question of intellectual acceptance of its contents fairly moot. The narrative feels packaged like a home story, where tidy and convenient resolutions obscure the lack of a logical movement from material evidence to correct interpretation. Wanderings thereby suggests the capability of spiritual narratives to marshal other worlds for a sense of awe and wonder, while strangely divesting themselves of deep consideration. Perhaps an advantage during Doyle's time due to the rising clamor for consumable and entertaining reading materials and the decline of spiritualism as a subject desiring a serious scientific attention. While Doyle would likely balk at these suggestions, his narrative movement ensured that his spiritual travels would at least make for a good story. Thank you.
Wonderful, great. Thank you, Mike, and thank you both speakers for keeping flawlessly to time, according to my clock. My notes show through the serendipity of conference panel, or through the genius of its planning, all kinds of correspondences across the papers. The sense of being in two worlds, the figuring of the reader in the texts, the presence of sea life, and Wales and Wales, which I'm afraid I can't stop myself from commenting on. So we've had some new arrivals in during those papers. So welcome. So if you'd like to, anyone would like to ask a question by raising a hand, and I'll keep an eye out, or by putting a question mark in the chat. Christine, thank you.
Okay, sorry, I don't want to hog the questions, but
No, please kick us off. That would be great.
Okay, I'll kick you off. Sorry, so much to say. Great paper, thank you both. Really, really interesting stuff. And Mike, first of all, greetings to Vancouver. Good for you for getting up so early. So say hello to everyone at UBC from me. I really, really enjoyed that paper, and I think you're exactly right about the way that Doyle uses science. It's almost never for actual evidentiary purposes. It seems almost like a kind of rhetorical flourish, that it's science adjacent without actually using it. And I was really wondering, I suppose, about this idea of, well, I suppose a lot of things, but your argument is that the seance always some ways brings us back to this world because he's a bit bored with the afterlife. I also think you're right about that. I think the spiritual world is boring to Doyle. But I just wonder, is there a contradiction there in the fact that the wanderings of a spiritualist is, in fact, I hate to say it, quite boring? Or our African Adventure, for example, the spiritualist travelogues. So, I mean, that sounds like a flippant remark, but I'm not sure it is. I mean, there's kind of an aimlessness in the way that narrative rolls out. So you know, if he's trying not to be boring, does it work? I guess that's my question. Sorry.
What I agree with you. It is quite boring, and for a very, very long text, it's quite incredible how long it goes on and on. But interestingly enough, I mean, Doyle, it's I guess further complicated by the fact that Doyle himself seems to recognize that this could be a very boring tale, because in the very first page, he sort of protects himself by saying that, you know, for minds that don't like a wandering narrative, they might want to put this down now and save themselves the trouble. So there's a weird self-admission that this sort of style of meandering, both geographically and intellectually, might not appeal to people, but it seemed to very much appeal to Doyle, and he recognizes that. But yeah, there is this sense, I think, for me, interestingly, stepping back, in which I think Doyle, trying to accomplish so much, sort of flattens the whole thing out. And I do find that interesting, and his travelogues do sort of follow kind of a similar kind of, I think, flattening. So, I mean, that's my long-winded way of saying I agree with you. That Doyle seems to recognize as well, and perhaps that's why his his travelogues only, I think, limited to 3 before he moved on to other things.
Thank you, Mike. So a question in the chat: have you published much of your work on Conan Doyle yet? Perhaps you can answer that in the chat if you'd rather, or Douglas has a question. Douglas, can we come to you if that's all right?
I'm just emerged from the ether. Thanks a lot. Two terrific papers, and I agree with Simon that there's quite a lot in these two papers talking to each other. And I've been sitting here trying to formulate a question that I could ask both of you together, and I haven't quite managed it. So instead, I'm going to put a question just to Anne this time. I enjoyed your paper a lot. I think there are 3 iterations of this story. There's the article Whaling in the Arctic. There's this one in the Idler, and then the story is told again in the autobiography Memories and Adventures. I'm very struck by what you have to say about genre, and I just want to sort of pull out a corner of that. There's a kind of, this is travel writing and in a sense sport writing. There's a kind of modern travel writing which is quite nostalgic, in that it comes packaged in the idea that the world being represented in this discourse is endangered or no longer exists. And there's a bit of that in the Conan Doyle whaling stories. And I'd like to ask you how prominently you think that affects the tone of the thing. And there are other things as adventure and the exotic and so on. But the sense of a vanishing world.
I think one of the things that really interests me in it is that it kind of forces him to think about the future a lot in there. I didn't talk an awful lot about that, apart from that end part when he's imagining very soon that we'll be off curing all our diseases on voyages out to the Arctic. But there's another part where he also imagines a future where there are museums with the skeletons of the whales fixed with the skeletons of the sailors who have had this accident befallen to them and been eaten by the whales. And so I think he finds it, I think he sees this nostalgic sense of the past kind of permeating forwards into the future. And I think it's kind of almost holding everything together in a way. But I do also think that it's really hard to pin down in here, because he's also quite taken with the harpoon gun that's got rid of this idealistic past harpooner who's stood on the prow flinging his harpoon instead. So he welcomes that technological innovation too. So yeah, it's an odd mix there. I don't know if that's quite answered that, but yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. It is an odd mix, and it's made even odder by the illustrations, I think, because that last illustration that you showed us seemed to be completely at odds tonally.
Absolutely.
From the rest of the thing, with this sort of wretched man whose legs presumably have been swallowed by the whale. Yes. And he's reduced to beggary, but he seems to be quite cheerful.
Strange, he does, and I think that brings, I mean, the Idler is full of humour, and I think it shifts it back to the overarching tone perhaps of the magazine as a whole, through that image. But I don't know if that takes something away from the rest of the narrative.
Interesting. Thank you.
Thanks.
Actually, Simon, may I jump into that as well?
Please do.
Okay. I don't want to get in the way of anyone else's questions though. I didn't see any hands up though, so I thought it would be safe to do so. But just bouncing off of Anne's response and Douglas's initial question, I was thinking back to Christine's comment about the Cottingley ferries, and about this this kind of layering of nostalgia, but perhaps also trying to move forward into some sort of into a recreation of a future that perhaps includes some of those nostalgic elements. And I was actually struck, because actually just a couple of days ago I was doing some research for this talk. Doyle actually wrote his original Cottingley ferries piece just before his trip to New Zealand and Australia, and so he had this in his mind, this this appearance of the ferries upon English soil, and the ways in which it's lamenting of a past. But as he's writing The Wanderings, he's also very clearly reconstructing a kind of religious future, building up the spiritualist churches. And I know, as Diana Barsham's remarked, this sort of Doyle's attempt to sort of recover a Christian past, a Christian English past that is kind of reframed as spiritualist. So in Cottingley Ferries, I wonder how much can we push to see that there's both a kind of fear and nostalgia of a world disappearing, while also trying to push that world forward in the future. What might the future of the ferries look like through the eyes of spiritualists. I don't know, but it's something to think about.
Yes, I think that the temporal dynamics in both of these papers are kind of absolutely fascinating as well too. I think that the looking forward and the looking back, the imagining of future temporalities, but also the kind of atavism or primitivism, both in the activities of looking for fairies and looking for whales. I had a question for you both, but I think that would be an abuse of chair's privilege to ask it, so I'll communicate it separately perhaps, because I know our next session is scheduled to start at 10 past, so I should do my duty diligently and allow us all a 5-minute break. But can we thank both of our speakers for such rich and thought-provoking papers. So let me do that on behalf of everyone. And shall we just take a 5-minute break?
Yeah. Thanks, Simon.
Thank you,
Thank you
Simon.
both.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you very much.
Well done.
Yeah, being on the Today Show.
We've got a bad batch of food or something.
Hi, Christine. Can you see me, by the way?
I can see both of you. Hello, Niels and Elise. Good to see you.
Could I just say, there's no need to read out my whole bio. I realize I wrote a very long bio, which would be very boring for everyone.
No, it's good. It's good.
Just like the first line.
Okay, well, let's see. You've both got very good book shelf backdrops there. Quite impressive.
Cobbling it together over the course of pandemic, the mandatory bookshelf.
Yeah, exactly. We all need it. Okay. It's 10 after. It seems like a short break, but I wonder if we might just start anyway so we can make sure to start on time. So hello everyone, welcome back. We hope you get a chance to grab a wee coffee or something there. This is the first of our genres panels. We've got 2 papers on it. From Elise Bulfin and from Niels Clausen, speaking to us from Ireland and Saskatchewan, respectively. So we've got a nice geographic spread there. Our first speaker is Elise Bulfin, who is based at University College Dublin, and she works on 19th century and contemporary culture with a focus on difficult aspects of human experience. That includes work on war trauma, on ideas around climate change, and currently there's a project on representations of child sexual abuse. This paper also deals with, well, not child sexual abuse, but with catastrophe in the Poison Belt. It's called Pretty Doin's What? Arthur Conan Doyle's The Poison Belt as an Anti-Catastrophe Tale. And I'll introduce Niels just before his paper. So Elise, if you want to go ahead, do you have a PowerPoint?
Yeah, I'm just going to try to share my screen with you. So can you see that? Can you hear me? Because everything's just gone.
I can hear and see you.
Yeah, I can hear and see.
Okay, that's great. So by the early 20th century, the catastrophe tale was a well-established subgenre in the speculative fiction of the industrialized world. It was part of a fictional engagement with what can be thought of as the pervasive apocalyptic imaginary in fantasiac culture. This is a myriad of images of degeneration, total war, natural and environmental catastrophe, which is my focus today, and the fall of civilization. Today, I'm going to look at Doyle's The Poison Belt in this context. This is the second Professor Challenger tale, and its dramatic scenario envisages Challenger and his friends as the sole survivors after the Earth passes through what's described as a poison belt of ether, which kills all other living creatures, or at least seems to. So despite this catastrophe-driven plotline, I'm going to argue that Doyle was subverting the by then well-known tropes of this speculative subgenre to create an anti-catastrophe tale, which mocked the typically grandiose style of this strand of writing and problematized the sweeping social Darwinist assumptions which pervaded it. By the late 19th century, hang on, just having a little bit of trouble moving through slides now. Yeah, there we go. Okay. By the late 19th century, the impact of human activity on the non-human world was patently apparent. And as Richard Grove, Jesse Oak Taylor, and many other critics discuss, there was an increasing awareness of environmental damage and calls to address it. This led to the scientific study of human impacts on the environment, to anti-pollution legislation to try to tackle the most obvious problems like smog and acid rain, and what would now be called environmentalist activism, things like forest conservation and wildlife protection movements, in which John Ruskin, for example, was prominent. As Ruskin laments, the misuse we made of our discoveries will be remembered against us by future generations. Our ingenuity, our technology and science will be disregarded in the face of the fact that we destroyed in civilized Europe every rare bird and secluded flower. And I really do hate to think what Ruskin would think if he, knew about the 6th extinction, which he was witnessing the beginnings of. But as well as in more obvious environmental writing like Ruskin's, and as Alan McDuffie observes, imaginative literature was another place where 19th century societies worked through the possible ramifications of environmental changes. And one literary response to environmental degradation was the strand of late 19th century speculative or science fiction, which imagined natural and environmental catastrophe, and in which the poison belt can be placed, though my argument today is that it doesn't sit straightforwardly within this. This strand involves things like H.G. Wells's tale of comet catastrophe. There were many other comet tales. There were several smog tales, of which William Delisle Hayes' The Doom of the Great City was an early one. There were volcano disaster tales. There were even tales imagining climate change, and I'd argue that Richard Jefferies' The After London can be placed within that strand. As I've argued elsewhere about these tales, by focusing on determining the causes of the catastrophes in them, it's possible to see links emerging between seemingly natural catastrophe and human activity in 19th century thinking, and then the development of what can be viewed of as a kind of environmental awareness. And I just want to outline quickly some other relevant key tropes and narrative techniques of this set of catastrophe tales to enable the comparison with the Poison Belt. Catastrophe tales tend to draw strongly on the tropes of horror and, to a certain extent, tragedy, to present shocking scenarios of mass death and destruction laden with negative effect. Tours through corpse-strewn cities, as you can see here in the illustration from Doom, you can see deceased people in cab horses at the bottom of the illustration, and you can see something very similar in this illustration from M.P. Shields' The Purple Cloud. These kinds of scenes were a staple of the genre, as the first quote here on screen demonstrates, which describes the extent to which the dead lay upon the streets and in the houses. It was impossible to walk anywhere without treading on them. These kinds of scenes are typically narrated in highly inflated language, as per the second quote here, which describes how when the poison volcanic gas overtook people, overtook London, it must have more resembled Tartarus and the foul shades of hell than aught to which my fancy can liken it. So these kinds of descriptions are aimed at producing the chief narrative effects associated with the horror mode, effects of dread, disgust, anxiety, fear, and shock, as Neil Martin outlines. As I said, also the tropes of tragedy could be used to invite pity for the victims, although the victims are more typically presented as a faceless mass. But you do sometimes get the emotional cues for sympathy present in accounts, for example, of survivors' plights or even of passing depictions of child victims. You can think of Mary Shelley's Last Man, that's a lot earlier than these tales, as being an example of this kind of pathos-drenched kind of catastrophe tale. So the second catastrophe contention I want to draw attention to is that often the causes of mass death in these tales are attributed to human vice and folly, and this is in order to support the text's underlying admonitory quasi-environmentalist messages that humanity needs to change its ways and check untrammeled development, or have its development checked for it, as in this really deeply unpleasant quote from Robert Barr's The Doom of London, A Deadly Smog Tale. So this is completely straight now, this is not sarcastic. The simultaneous blotting out of millions of human beings was a beneficial event, the good results of which we still enjoy. Londoners were so dull-witted and stupid, so sodden in the vice of mere money gathering, that nothing but their total extinction would have sufficed. And instead of being an appalling catastrophe, the doom of London was an unmixed blessing. So it's the extreme nature of these kinds of assertions that is the reason I'm labeling it a kind of quasi rather than full environmentalism. And you can see the strong affinity with social Darwinist and eugenicist ideas here. So the rest of the paper then will look at how Doyle used his skill as a storyteller to, I think, quite a different effect in The Poison Belt in the following ways. Minimizing negatively effective narrative cues, especially by drawing on a range of comedic forms, and also creating quite an anticlimactic ending. These tactics are all present, I would say, also in the third Professor Challenger tale, When the World Screamed, from 1928, but I don't have time to go into it, unfortunately. So in The Poison Belt, in general, with the exception of a few passages, it minimizes the more typical affective cues of horror, such as the lengthy dread and disgust-inducing passages I quoted earlier from The Purple Cloud. Even in the chapter The Dead World, which does describe the corpses that lie all across the landscape, Doyle eschews grandiose Gothic rhetoric, largely in favour of matter-of-fact descriptions, and death is related in small vignettes rather than at scale. For example, when he recounts the narrator accounts coming across a gaily dressed pleasure party who've succumbed in their great glittering motor car. The Poison Belt also minimises emotional cues for inviting readerly sympathy or empathy with the catastrophe's victims or its stranded survivors, such as might be offered by a narrator's account of experiencing strong emotions, as Marianne Martinez describes in her account of how readers engage with stories. This is because the predominant response to the catastrophe of the focalising character, the journalist Edward Malone, in his own words, is a kind of detached attention. And in response to the dead, he describes his numbness. The very vastness of the horror took away from its personal appeal. Crowds merged into a universal phenomenon, which one soon accepted as the inevitable detail of every scene. So he's not providing emotional cues for either pity or dread through which similar emotions might be invited or prompted in the reader. But the main way that the Poison Belt eschews the catastrophe genre's typical affective cues is, of course, its sustained use of many different types of humour. And there's been a lot written on comedy in the Challenger tales, especially on satire. And also Kate Halterhoff recently demonstrating just how integral humour is to the Challenger tales via her analysis of their illustrations. In the Poison Belt, slapstick and the absurd are recurrently used to mock the Challenger character. For example, in the opening scenes in which the initial effects of the poison ether are highly comedic in general. We have the distinguished Professor Summerlee crowing like a cockerel, and we learn that Challenger has just undertaken an experiment which involves biting his housekeeper on the leg. In general, the opening scenes, which really send up all of the characters, function to undermine any of their subsequent series pronouncements, which I'll come to a little bit later. Now, another key use of humour is to undermine or diffuse the text's more serious moments. For example, as well as Malone's lack of emotion, the account of the dead is undermined by a key narrative strategy in the Poison Belt. This is the immediate swerve from horror into humour. And the pretty doings of the paper's title refer to the absurdly callous refrain roared by the aristocratic adventurer character Lord John Roxton as he negotiates the corpse-strewn streets of post-catastrophe London at some speed in Challenger's large car. As Gary Hoppenstand puts it of When the World Screamed, Doyle employs humour in his story to displace the horror, and I'd say in doing so, he uses humour to a far greater extent than the biting social satire more typical of the catastrophe tale. And overall, the effect of the humour is to send up the catastrophe genre's moralising mission. And then the last major way in which the Poison Belt rejects the conventions of the catastrophe tale is in its severe curtailing of the duration and effects of the catastrophe. The victims are in fact not dead, they've merely been in a poison-induced coma from which they awaken unscathed and oblivious after just 28 hours, creating a highly anticlimactic ending for the tale. And this is evident in this very prosaic illustration which shows the golfers who'd been seen through Challenger's windows apparently dead in the fields waking up and resuming their golf game, which is very much at odds with the far more bloodthirsty denouements of most catastrophe tales. Now, as scholars like Douglas Kerr and James Berger assert in general of end-of-the-world fantasies, the end is never the end. The apocalyptic text announces and describes the end of the world, but then the text does not end, nor does the world represented in the text. Something remains after the end. In this vein, a key trope you can see in fantasiac catastrophe tales overall is that which I describe as mass extinction as progress. In other words, as per the quote from Robert Barr earlier, the catastrophe functions to clear away the purportedly degenerate mass of current humanity, paving the way for a more highly evolved future race to emerge post-catastrophe from the usually superior group of survivors who remain. Doyle's denouement, by contrast, I mean, he does do a little bit of this, but I think his denouement is much more like a practical joke, and he plays with and problematizes the logic of mass extinction as progress throughout the Poison Belt. And we see it in his Wellesian metaphor at the beginning of the narrative, where the Challenger describes a cosmic gardener who wishes to rid his grapes, the earth, of a noxious bacillus, which is humanity, and hence passes them through a disinfecting medium, the poison ether, in order to breed some fresh bacillus less noxious than the last. That would be humanity 2.0. But this harsh logic is undercut because Challenger espouses the very Doylean contention that death itself is not the end, but the beginning of a new life in the spirit world, but mainly because the poison belt ultimately affects its social transformation without mass death. The final chapter of The Great Awakening describes how the close global brush with extinction instilled humility and reverence in humanity, and empty lives wasted formerly in aimless pursuits were channeled into saner and healthier ways, which have so raised the standard of life of these islands. So although pre-catastrophe life and behaviour is indicted in this passage, it's never suggested as the cause of the catastrophe as other tales do. And although the catastrophe has been beneficial, the key point is its positive transformations are affected in the lives of those already in existence. In other words, Doyle presents society as capable of reform without the need to kill off swathes of people. And in this assertion, Doyle is challenging the eugenicist assumptions of many other catastrophe tales, such as those of Barr, Sheil, and also Wells, who does this a lot in his work. And I think even sort of limiting this espousal of the beneficial catastrophe logic even more is the fact that everyone Malone can see waking up through the window, like the golfers getting up to resume their game, they all go on in the very same groove in which they had halted, suggesting, as per our current post-lockdown returns to pre-pandemic normality, things like full traffic, people will ultimately return to their old habits post-catastrophe. So Doyle's kind of espousing the idea of a great transformation and undercutting it on the other hand. Now, in conclusion, I want to look briefly at another way in which the poison belt engages with some of the currents present in fin de siècle thought about relations between the human and the non-human world. And so this is a little bit more of an eco-critical reading. As well as critiquing the mass extinction as progress logic, the poison belt stages an unresolved debate between two competing 19th century world views. A dominant human exceptionalist one, which, as Steve Asselin, writing on economically driven fantasy science fiction, as he describes this view, it sees the non-human world unproblematically in terms of its use value for humanity. And this chimes with what the ecofeminist Val Plumwood describes as backgrounding, a pervasive tendency in Western culture to treat the non-human world on which human life depends as secondary and subordinate. So according to Plumwood, backgrounding is the denial of human dependence on biospheric processes and a view of humans as a part outside of nature, and nature is treated as a limitless provider without needs of its own. This is a view explicitly espoused by Challenger in The Lost World, for example, when he says, "I may yet show you how a great mind molds all nature to its use." The opposing view, which shares aspects of the catastrophe genre's genuine concern about unchecked human development, considers the non-human world to exist in its own right, indifferent to human requirements. And this resonates with some of our more contemporary views. In the poison belt, these opposing ideas manifest chiefly in a mid-narrative debate between Challenger and Summerlee. Challenger, as we see him in this scene here, on finding that amoebas have survived the poison, surmises that the cycle of life will begin again, and in some few millions of years hence, human life will spring again from this tiny root. And mid-debate, he also says things like, "We can surely say that we are the highest thing in nature." But Summerlee challenges Challenger's implicit position that the object for which this world was created was that it should produce and sustain human life. He suggests this is a monstrous conceit. And he says, think of all the millions of years that the Earth swung empty through space. Man only came into being yesterday as far as geological time goes. Why then should it be taken for granted that all this stupendous preparation was for his benefit? It may have been an accident. It's as if the scum upon the surface of the ocean imagined that the ocean was created in order to produce and sustain it. Now, certainly in Malone's account of the debate between them, Summerlee's points are given more space and Challenger's rebuttal is lost in a characteristic narrative swerve into humour. But whose side, if anyone's, does the narrative ultimately come down on? Robert earlier mentioned the same kind of tension in relation to the Lost World, and so this kind of ambivalence, it seems to be a characteristic of Doyle's work. Now, in general, there is ambivalence in fantasy-esque natural catastrophe fiction, as it's pulled between these two perspectives, between a more radical proto-environmental consciousness and a political conservativeness, whereby the fiction serves to offer comfort, re-human supremacy, and even to habituate readers to environmental disaster as a necessary byproduct of modernity. And so there's ambivalence in Doyle's tale too. We have Summerlee's decentering of humanity, which reveals an awareness of humanity as a species subject to the forces of the non-human world, which surrounds it and are oblivious to its existence. Indeed, the whole tale does this. It's the logic of the poison belt. But this momentary foregrounding of the non-human world is undercut by the competing views espoused by Challenger. And Challenger, of course, is a favourite character of Doyle's, and he's always vindicated as a superior intellect throughout the tales. So you could argue who wins the debate. But I'd say ultimately all serious intellectual positions proffered by the characters are undermined by the sustained use of humour to ridicule them throughout the text. So perhaps ultimately the text serves to mock rather than to further either worldview.
Thanks so much for that excellent paper, Lisa. Lots of really interesting points to discuss there. But we'll move on and have the discussion to the end. Our next paper is from Niels Clausen, who is a Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Regina. He's published many articles on Arthur Conan Doyle in a wide range of venues, and is also the author of the monograph Arthur Conan Doyle's Art of Fiction, a Reevaluation, which was shortlisted for the HRF Keating Award for Nonfiction in 2019. And he's also currently editing a new collection of essays on Doyle that's going to be coming out, I guess, early in 2022, hopefully. So. Fantastic. So his paper today is called The Narratologist versus the Detective, the Structure of the Holmes Stories Re-Examined. Take it away.
Thank you very much. My goal can be stated succinctly. I want to propose an alternative to the dominant way we understand the narrative structure of the Holmes stories. I have put Holmes stories in scare quotes because the term misrepresents these stories by erroneously assuming that they have a uniformity of structure defined by the role played in them by Sherlock Holmes. That is, they are assumed to be stories that chronicle the adventures or cases of Sherlock Holmes, consulting detective. This structure, with Holmes at its center, has seemed so obvious that questions about the structure of the stories have not been at the forefront of Conan Doyle criticism over the past few decades. The earliest structural model was that offered back in 1911 by Ronald Knox in his Studies in the Literature of Sherlock Holmes. Then in 1925, the Russian formalist Viktor Shklovsky proposed what he called a constituent structure grammar of the stories, consisting of 9 constituent parts that look a lot like a Proppian version of Father Knox's 11 elements. What all these models have in common is the assumption that the structure of a Holmes story corresponds to the unfolding of Holmes's investigation of and solution to a crime or mystery. And this structure looks a lot like that of the typical analytic detective story, which was given one of its influential formulations 45 years ago by John Coelty in his seminal study, Adventure, Mystery, and Romance. According to Coelty, this structure, or pattern as he calls it, consists of 6 phases. Quote, 1, introduction of the detective, 2, crime and clues, 3, investigation, 4, announcement of the solution, 5, explanation of the solution, and 6, denouement. These 6 parts, he says, do not always appear in sequence and are sometimes collapsed into each other, but it is difficult to conceive of a classical detective story without them, end quote. Another structural model of the detective story is that proposed by Zvetan Todorov, who in his influential essay, The Typology of Detective Fiction, argues that the structure of the classic whodunit consists of two stories, the story of the crime and the story of the investigation. The story of the investigation, presided over by the detective, incorporates Coelti's phases 2, 3, 4, and 5, and may also include 1. At the base of the whodunit, Todorov theorizes, we find what he calls a duality, and it is this duality that will guide our description. This novel, the whodunit, contains not one but two stories, the story of the crime and the story of the investigation. In their purest form, these two stories have no point in common. The first story, that of the crime, ends before the second begins. The characters of the second story, the story of the investigation, do not act, they learn, unquote. What these characters learn is who committed the crime and how and why it was committed. Thus, the story of the investigation narrates how the brilliant detective uncovers the concealed story of the crime. However, neither Coelti's 6 phases nor Todorov's duality provides an accurate description of the structure of many, and in my view, the most interesting and the best home stories, although I grant that they can be applied to at least some of them. The problem with both these models is that they fail to distinguish between Holmes's case and Conan Doyle's story because they take them to be virtually equivalent. But they are not. Coelti's model takes Holmes's investigation, including announcing and explaining his solution, as the essence of the story, framed by the introduction of the detective and the denouement. And Todorov's duality model assumes that the second of the two stories leads to complete knowledge of the first story. That is, the other characters, along with the reader, learn from the detective's investigation and explanation all of the hitherto hidden story of the crime. However, the distinctive feature of many of the so-called home stories, what distinguishes them both in narrative form and artistic value from the classic analytic detective story or whodunit, is that the knowledge and understanding of the crime that Holmes acquires at the end of his investigation is often incomplete and has to be supplemented by knowledge that comes to light only after his investigation, his case, is completely finished, knowledge that his method is unable to acquire. This important additional knowledge has little, if any, effect on Holmes. His case is over, but it radically affects the reader's response to Conan Doyle's story, which does not coincide with Holmes's investigation, announcement, and explanation. Holmes's case, while certainly important, is only one element in Conan Doyle's story. Todorov's model suffers from a similar deficiency, since there is more to Conan Doyle's stories than Holmes's solution to the mystery of a crime and his explanation of his solution. What has been overlooked, but is especially striking in these stories, is what Holmes does not know or learn. After Holmes's case is over, there is still much to be learned in order to understand and appreciate Conan Doyle's story. The alternative model that I'm proposing looks like this. In many of the Holmes stories, Holmes's case is framed by two narratives that are not part of his case. These are Watson's introduction before the case begins, and a second narrative told by the criminal after Holmes has, to his satisfaction, completed his investigation and announced and explained his solution. The second of these framing narratives is not a denouement, the tying up of loose ends, nor is it, as it is sometimes called, the backstory. This narrative structure is established in the first two Holmes stories, and it reappears in many of the short stories, though obviously in a condensed form. A Study in Scarlet is regularly criticized for its faulty narrative structure, but this criticism is based on the false assumption that Conan Doyle was trying to write a classic analytic detective story. Although there are two stories in the novel, they are not the story of the two murders in London and the story of the investigation by the detective of those murders. For Holmes and Watson never learn of the events that take place in Utah, and Holmes's investigation of the two murders in London is complete and his case over before the reader, and only the reader, hears of the crimes that took place decades earlier in Utah. There is nothing in part two of the story that Holmes needs to know in order to solve the two murders in London. Holmes has all the information he needs before part two begins. As a detective story, A Study in Scarlet is over, and all that is needed for Holmes to explain how he solved the twin murders of Drever and Strangerson, which he does in part three, which picks up the detective story where part one left off. What part two does is to radically alter the reader's, but not Holmes's and Watson's, perception of the criminal presented in part one. In part two, Holmes is not the criminal, but rather the victim of crimes in a story in which the two criminals, Strangerson and Drever, go unpunished. What part two does is to force readers to reconsider the conclusion about hope that they came to at the end of part one, when they still thought they were reading a detective story about a brilliant consulting detective who easily identifies the murderer and lures him to 221B Baker Street, where he is promptly arrested. Case over. At the end of part one, Hope appears to be a murderer who will now receive the justice he deserves. But part two forces readers to reconsider the conclusion they had prematurely come to at the end of part one. Hope is now no longer a murderer, but the victim of atrocious crimes, a hero seeking justice in the form of revenge. The reader now identifies not with the detective, but with someone the reader had previously taken to be a murderer. The Country of the Saints, the title is of course ironic, is a crime novel which is narrated from the perspective of the victim of crime. This second narrative is designed to raise the question of how a victim should respond to crimes in a society where the powerful can get away with committing crimes, including murder. Utah is a country ruled not by saints, but by corrupt theocrats. In the second narrative, Conan Doyle's story maneuvers the reader into showing at least some sympathy for a murderer. In his study, The Crime Novel, a Deviant Genre, Tony Hilfer makes the following distinction between the detective story and the crime novel. Quote, "The function of the detective hero," he says, "is to guarantee the reader's absolution from guilt. This is basic to the genre's form of wish fulfillment. In contrast, the reader of the crime novel is maneuvered into various forms of complicity with the criminal." Unquote. Insofar as A Study in Scarlet is a detective story, it's certainly a deviant one. In the detective story, according to Hilfer, the question of guilt is unambiguously answered and reassuringly settled when the criminal is finally identified by the detective, an identification that assures readers that justice will be done. The reader, who has been identifying with Holmes as the detective hero, assumes that guilt has been proven and justice achieved when Hope, cleverly lured by Holmes to 221B Baker Street, and is dramatically identified and apprehended. Holmes's fixing of Hope's guilt appears to ensure that justice has been done. But then the abrupt shift in narrative form and voice and the representation of Hope as crime victim undermines that assurance. The function of The Country of the Saints, then, is not, as is often claimed, to fill in the backstory of the events in Watson's narrative. Watson and Holmes never hear it, but rather to shift the focus of the novel away from Holmes's scientific investigation, chapter 2 is called The Science of Deduction, to the irresolvable moral questions of revenge, guilt, and justice that Holmes's science of deduction and analysis cannot answer. Indeed, Holmes has no interest in answering them since his case is over. And once his case is completed, he moves on to the next one, filling in the interval with a 7% solution of cocaine. The same narrative structure reappears in the next Holmes story, The Sign of Four. When the murderer of Major Sholto is identified and arrested, the novel is far from over. For the arrest is followed by Jonathan Small's first-person narrative, which again is not the backstory of the murder in London, but rather is designed to raise questions about justice that Holmes's Science of Deduction, the title of chapter 1, cannot answer, and that Holmes is not much interested in answering. Detective Athelney Jones says to Small, "If you had helped justice instead of thwarting it in this way, you would have had a better chance at your trial." To which Small replies, "Justice? A pretty justice? Whose loot is this, if not ours? Where is the justice that I should give it up to those who have never earned it?" After hearing the strange story of Jonathan Small, the title of chapter 12, the reader is maneuvered into the judgment that whatever his sins may be, Small is as much sinned against as sinning. Conan Doyle never abandoned this narrative structure, which regularly reappears in the short stories. In The Cardboard Box, for example, the narrative of Holmes's investigation is over, his case complete, when he hears James Browner's narrative of his crime, a narrative that forces readers to reconsider the judgment of Browner as a sadistic criminal that they have likely formed by the time Holmes announces his solution to the case. Although Holmes's investigation does reconstruct the events that have led to two severed ears from two people being mailed to Miss Susan Cushing in Croydon, there is still more to this story than Holmes's case, which ends with the identification and arrest of the man responsible for the macabre crimes. When Holmes's investigation is complete and the perpetrator identified, Conan Doyle's story is still far from over. At this point, Conan Doyle embeds in his story James Browner's first-person account of the events and, most importantly, his state of mind leading up to the crime and after it. Holmes learns all of this only after Browner has been identified and arrested. Browner's narrative is not part of the denouement, for it does not tie up loose ends. Rather, it alters the reader's view of the crime and the criminal. The story of Holmes's investigation and his announcement of how he identified the perpetrator is only a partial reconstruction of Todorov's story of the crime. Holmes's investigation is focused on the events that took place after the two murders, explaining how the severed ears arrived in Croydon and identifying who sent the cardboard box. There is no way that the portrait of Browner that emerges from his statement to the police of the double murders could have been reconstructed by Holmes's science of deduction and analysis. Yet this portrait is an essential part of Conan Doyle's story. The same pattern recurs in both The Golden Pince-Nez and The Dancing Men. In the former, Holmes investigates what appears to be a motiveless murder and discovers that the woman responsible for the young man's death is being concealed in a secret chamber in the house where the unintended death took place. But when the hiding spot is revealed, the woman in hiding, Anna, tells a story of events that took place in Russia decades before, events that Holmes has no knowledge of and did not need to know in order to solve his case. But the reader needs to know these events in order to understand the full import of Conan Doyle's story. Holmes's investigation, his case, is over when Anna tells her story, a story that raises questions about guilt that Holmes is not at all interested in pondering. We are all guilty, Anna proclaims. Similarly, in The Dancing Men, Holmes breaks the code of the dancing men and, using the code, lures the suspect, Abe Slaney, to the scene of the crime, just as he had lured Jefferson Hope to Baker Street. But when Slaney arrives, he tells a story that forces the reader to form a judgment about him that contradicts the judgment of him that Holmes had formed based on his investigation. As in The Dancing Men, there is plenty of guilt to go around in this story, too. To conclude, there are, I believe, three major implications of the alternative structure that I am proposing for at least some of the Holmes stories. First, this narrative structure, which is based on a clear distinction between Holmes's case and Conan Doyle's story, makes the stories much more complex than Coelti's and Todorov's models of the detective story allow. And second, this complexity should lead us to reassess Holmes's methods as they are represented in the story. His methods are completely adequate when confronted with the problem of solving a cipher code or figuring out how two severed ears got posted from Ireland to London. But when it comes to fathoming the mind of the man who severed the ears of the two people he murdered, or determining whether private revenge is ever justified when the law provides no opportunity whatsoever to secure justice, Holmes's science of deduction and analysis can offer no answers. And finally, the artistic value of Holmes's stories will, I believe, greatly increase when we shift critical attention away from Sherlock Holmes and his case and place it on the complex narrative art of Arthur Conan Doyle. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for those excellent papers. I wish we had a bit more time to discuss them, but we do have a few minutes here. Really listening to the papers, what struck me is that they share is a sense of the way in which Doyle fits uneasily within the genres and the formulas to which he has often been assigned, whether that be the apocalyptic thriller, kind of gloating over mass death, or these neat formulas of how Doyle's story and Holmes' stories coincide. So I think you've both left us with strategies for a more complex understanding of the work here. But let's have some stories and comments from the audience. Who would like to jump in here? We've got, do we have a hand? Questions for Niels and Alice, please. Yes, Mark, please.
Thanks very much. Thank you both for wonderful papers. Just a couple of observations. I think the poison belt in particular, I reread that right at the beginning of the pandemic, and that final paragraph is quite astonishing in terms of the idea of renegotiating humanity's existence as a result of a close proximity to a near-death experience for the whole planet, for the whole civilization, as it were. The one thing that did strike me in that is I wondered how much Conan Doyle was playing on the notion of Malthusian check, this idea that actually, you know, there's a lot of stuff in there which reflects back on that view of the Black Death being a natural check on society. And I think he plays with some of those ideas in there. And just an observation on Niels, I think is really interesting. Alternative interpretation you have of the Sherlock Holmes stories, and I think there might be some evidence in support of your case, sort of in reverse, as it were, from the Abbey Grange, where the motivations of the characters are much more worn on the sleeve and a part of the investigation, and suddenly Holmes and Watson, well, Watson specifically takes on the role of the British jury at the end by passing judgment, which sort of picks up on that moral side of the investigation that you were saying, you know, often it's not part of Holmes's domain to for him to be successful in the case, but when it does come across his path, you actually see a nice resolution of those two parts. So just a couple of observations on what I thought were both excellent papers.
Great. If either Elise or Niels would like to respond.
I have a question for Elise, if I may.
Sure.
How does H.G. Wells's War of the Worlds fit into this genre? Because it's usually read as an invasion novel in the context of the threat from Germany and whatnot. So should we reconsider how we read the War of the Worlds? There's a lot of massacre of people, right, in the novel.
There is, and there's those really horrific refugee scenes that always stay with me when people are leaving London. He doesn't really do the mass extinction as evolutionary progress trope so much in that novel, although ultimately, obviously, evolution triumphs in that it's a germ that overcomes the Martians. But I suppose that one's maybe more like Challenger in the Lost World, in that it's a Darwinian battle between different species. So I don't know if we can read the Martians as a natural or environmental catastrophe, though I suppose you can see the technological imprints of conflict on the landscape, certainly in the War of the Worlds. But where I'd be talking about Wells and his real buying into the logic of mass extinction as allowing a leap forward for evolution would be in things like The War in the Air and The World Set Free, where you have a scientist speaking from a future rational, ordered scientific society after the massive air war, some several hundred years into the future. And the ultimate logic is that it was good that there was a huge air war and most people died because it's allowed this scientific society to come about. It's a muted strain in it, but it's there. It's much more present in The World Set Free from 1914, where Wells imagines nuclear weapons wiping out most of the cities, and again, a kind of a utopian technocratic society emerging afterwards.
That's great. Thanks so much. I can see there's another question, but because we need to start the other panel at 4, I'm going to ask, I think it was Christine, if you could use the chat for that. We'll take the quickest of breaks and we'll be back here for the next genres panel. So thanks again for 2 excellent papers. Thanks very much.